Evening. Good evening. My name is Kurt Owens. I serve as president of the Milwaukee Declaration, and want to welcome you here for another pastors forum on race in America. And for those of you who don't know, Milwaukee Declaration is a group of pastors from the suburban and urban communities in Wisconsin, and we kind of come together to stand against the racial divides in our city, and we just want to kind of come together and lead the discussion on what it looks like to essentially racial reconstruction is a term that we use, and we use that term as opposed to racial reconciliation, simply because there's really never been a time in the history of America where there's been peaceful relationships between the Black and white community at large. Certainly there's been some decent individual relationships, but just as a community at large. And so we use the term reconstruction because it's about changing people's perceptions and their minds and the way that we think about the other. And so again, we've kind of come together to kind of help pursue that peace in our city. And so today we're going to have that conversation on race in America, and we have a number of pastors that's joining me today from the Milwaukee Declaration. I'm going to have them to introduce themselves, and I'll start out with Jay English. If you can introduce yourself, it'd be great.
Hey everybody, my name is Jay English, and I'm the founder and the president of Plain English Incorporated, where our primary objective is building bridges to address issues of race and culture. So happy to be here. Thank you, Pastor Kurt, for allowing me to be a part of this.
Thank you, Pastor Jay. We have Kevin Penrose. I'm going to have Penvose. I'm sorry. I'm going to have him introduce himself as well.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Pastor Kevin Penvose. I serve with Unity Lutheran Church in Milwaukee. It's on the south side in the Bayview neighborhood. And I've been doing anti-racism work for, I guess, longer than I can remember, several years, and have been connected with the Milwaukee Declaration almost since its founding. It's a blessing to be with you all today.
Thanks, Kevin. We have Peter Borg joining us. If you can introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Borg. I am formerly the pastor of Citybrook Church, and I am also a historian of race and religion in the United States. My work primarily looks at white Protestant churches and how they respond to race and racism and create it, in fact, in the United States.
Thank you, Peter, for that introduction. We have Brian Marvel, if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, hey everybody, my name is Brian Marvel, and I am the senior pastor at Meadowbrook Church in the Wauwatosa area. I've been connected with the Milwaukee Declaration just a handful of months, just this summer. I learned about it this summer and was eager to join up with this group of folks. And so it's a privilege to be with you all today. So thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Brian, for joining us today. And lastly, we have Dr. Marcus Arrington, if you can introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Pastor Kurt. Marcus Arrington, lead pastor, Park Lawn Assembly of God here in the city of Milwaukee. I too am newer to the Milwaukee Declaration family and pleased to be a part of today's discussion.
All right. Thank you again for all of our panelists that's joining us today. We have a number of questions. I think it's interesting that we point out that the questions that we are asking are not our own questions. These are questions that we've heard from people. And in most cases, some of these questions only happen in a homogenous group of people. And so what we like to do is we take those questions that's only asked in the Black community and we bring it here and have those discussions, or we'll take those questions that's only asked by the white community and we'll bring it here and we'll add some color to it. And so if you're watching and you have some questions, feel free to throw them in the chat box and we'll see if we can kind of address those too. Again, the biggest thing for us is that we're having those conversations through the lens of the gospel. And so the very first question today, I love throwing him on the hot seat because he seems to be able to handle the hot seat very well. Jay English, first question I'm going to pose to you today is we hear the question is why can't Black people just get over it and move forward?
Just gonna start off with me and throw me under the bus. Thank you, Pastor Kurt. We can't get over it because it's still happening. That's the primary thing that I think people don't understand. Things that happen, when you're in a situation where there are certain disparities and those disparities continue, you're not given an opportunity to just get over it and to just get past it. Nothing has been done to bring those disparities back into a level of equality, and we have disparities across the board. I was teaching a session and I told them there's either two truths here, and one of them is true. Either we as African Americans, there actually is something wrong with us. There actually is something in our DNA that makes us literally as a person less than everyone else, or systemic racism actually is real. Because when you look across the spectrum of all the different areas, from economics to education to child mortality, we can go down the list of unemployment, housing, like we can just keep going. We seem to be near the top in every one. And it makes me ask the question of, is something actually wrong with us, or is there actually systemic racism? I'm convinced that it's not us. I'm convinced. And so if you say, why can't you just get over it? It's because it's still happening. Redlining is still happening. Housing disparities still happening. Issues of healthcare still happening. Right now, COVID-19, we are 3 to 5 times more likely to die from it. Still happening. This is why we can't just get over it.
Thanks, Jay, for sharing. I'm going to pose that same question to Dr. Marcus. When you hear that question, why can't Black people just get over it and move forward?
Thanks, Pastor Kurt. I echo what Pastor Jay mentioned, but I also would add to what he said is that because it's still happening, we've not had adequate time to heal. And so there are wounds that even if, say, there's progress, because we can definitely point to progress in areas where things were more severe, much more harsh, perhaps in times past, but even when steps of progress are made, there are new developments. There are newer ways systemically to dominate, to disenfranchise, and to oppose the more broad and perhaps sweeping opportunities for a larger group within the African American community to begin to make improvements. And it rips open those wounds. I think about collective trauma that individuals suffer from. My background prior to pastoral care and leadership has been in education. And I can tell you that with all the new curriculum that's presented every year and so many new facets of technology, we still have many of the same disparities that exist in our public school districts. Funding in inner cities compared to suburban schools continues to be an issue, and largely that's drawn along lines of color. And so he's absolutely right. And like I said, because of that, it's difficult to heal. And I would say the biggest piece of that healing process happens to be in our minds. You even saw with some of the more recent athletic contests, even in the NBA, where I saw one player, they had different expressions on their jerseys, and it was a phrase, "love us." It's the feeling of not being wanted, which we could equate to being rejected. And any person that deals with a severe rejection, it's not as easy as just get over it. There are steps that have to be endured in terms of that healing process.
Thanks for sharing, Dr. Marcus. Just adding to that, I think for myself personally, if I'm posed with that question, similar to some of the things that you guys have said already, but I think for me is I just see it when it comes to some of the disparities and the injustice that had happened throughout the history of America, and it's really never really been addressed in America. And so it would almost be, I like to compare it to like if your loved one was raped And even though, the person who did it may not be around anymore, I think just telling them to get over it and move on without any form of uh, healing that takes place is just really, really difficult. And so it's just really difficult for me to look at the plight of the central city of Milwaukee or any place else, central city around our country, and not believe that there's some connection to our past that has led us to where we are today. And so I think we can begin to start moving forward when we are able to maybe address some of the disparities that has transpired in our community due to some of the problems that we know that happened in the past. And this is not a blame, and I think that that's another difficult thing, is because no one wants to be blamed for what happened years ago, and so it's not a place of blame. But I think it's a place of recognizing that, like, man, we're still digging ourselves out of a hole. There's still a hole in our community, and we're still digging ourselves out of the hole. And so it's going to require people outside of our community to help us dig ourselves out of that hole. So with that being said, I'm going to pose the next question, and Peter, I'm going to pose this question over to you. It is, how is it that some white people don't believe in white privilege when they are the only group who can say, let's make America great again?
I think first and foremost, not having any relationships with people who are not very similar to them, and certainly no relationships across racial lines. So if you don't have personal friendships with people whose life experiences have been different from you, you have no way of understanding what that person's life is actually like. Imagine a bunch of unmarried 17-year-old guys talking about what women are like. Well, they won't know, because they're only surrounded by guys, and they have no life experience being married and having a wife tell them, nope, that's not exactly what I'm like. So it's the same thing. It's if you are devoid of historical information and you are devoid of relationships, then you believe whatever is in your echo chamber and you live there. It's more understandable for some rather than others. If you live in the middle of Kansas or the middle of Idaho, well, maybe you don't have a lot of opportunities to talk to people who are different from you, but you can buy books on Amazon. You can watch documentaries on Amazon. There's a lot of ways you could educate yourself. But then for people who live in major metropolitan areas, there's really no excuse. I mean, you can go ahead and find ways to build those relationships if it's a point of value to you.
Thanks for sharing, Peter. Brian, I'm going to pose that same question to you. How is it that some white people don't believe in white privilege when they are the only ethnic group who can say, let's make America great again?
Yeah, I think sometimes and sometimes I feel like I have a hard time speaking for the white community at large, right? I'm just one person in the midst of it all. But sometimes I think that there's this sense in which we have a hard time taking responsibility for, and you kind of alluded to this too, Kurt, of things that happened before we were even born, not even around. And so there's this sense in which the resistance of saying, like, hey, we feel like the blame might be coming our way, when it's like, how can I be responsible for things that didn't even happen when I was around? And so therefore, just the label of white privilege sometimes feels like, oh, so I'm supposed to take responsibility for things that maybe I didn't even do. And so I think part of the reason why we resist that is just for that sake of, like, do we really carry that responsibility? That's a question that I think turns over in people's heads. Do we really carry, is it really our fault? Or are we just now living in a reality that has been created over, decades and centuries? So I think it's the issue of responsibility, really, that white people sometimes wrestle with.
Thanks for sharing, Brian. Great perspective. Kevin, I'm going to pose that same question over to you. How is it that some white people don't believe in white privilege when they are the only ethnic group who can say, let's make America great again?
So I definitely agree with Peter and Brian about relationships and about responsibility. I'd add to that, by now we've gotten to a place where it depends on what team hat you wear, almost determines what facts you're going to accept. And I've been involved in anti-racism work long enough where I can remember a switch where this term started entering the popular conversation. It's a technical term from academics, right? In the 60s, sociologists started to study racism. And so it's been around for a long time, but it shifted from small circles to the general popular conversation just within the last few years. And it was introduced that way through media, through news talk shows, things like this, that immediately failed to define accurately what systemic racism is and put their own definition on it and just tagged it with labels of whatever, Marxism, communism, you name it, right? And so automatically a good portion of the American populace has been pre-biased to even taking a good look at systemic racism and just write it off before even considering it and not viewing it objectively at all. But if they were to accept systemic racism, then it's going to challenge this house of cards that's built on false premises. So why even risk that challenge and just dismiss it?
But thanks for sharing, Kevin. Appreciate your perspective. I'm going to move on to next question, and this I'm going to pose this to Dr. Marcus. The question is why don't Black people honor the flag in the same way as white people?
Well, I think I would first respond with the question and say, well, which Black people are you talking about? My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who's passed, was a vet. He was in the Korean War. So I think that question has to be disaggregated so that Blacks are not looked at as a monolith. The reality is there are many African Americans who are very patriotic. You can look at all the historical conflicts that our nation has been in, and you see the presence of Blacks who were very proud of what the ideal of America has been and has been articulated throughout generations. And so that's the first piece. Everybody doesn't share that sentiment. But in terms of those who may not share the same affinity, it is because what has been presented perhaps as an American dream, to quote Malcolm X, has really been an American nightmare. And so when you look at what Pastor Jay said a little bit earlier, how things don't change, right? Election after election, Democrat or Republican, you see some of the same things. You go to an inner city on the West Coast to the East Coast, you see some of the same disparities, right? There's a synchronicity to oppression. So it's like you can't escape it. So for all the richness and the grandeur that perhaps is presented on the surface, there's a whole lot more behind the scenes. And after decades and decades and generations of the same thing, there becomes a lack of respect and a disdain for what the flag is supposed to represent, because the very systems that are supposed to ensure that all people have equal opportunity and access to those ideals and the freedom and the pursuit of happiness, et cetera, those same systems have trapdoors. They have, it's almost like a labyrinth where you think you're making progress and you hit a dead end. And so there's an inconsistency in practice that exists. And therefore, you have a number of folks in the African American community who resist embracing the flag and what it represents.
Thank you for sharing, Dr. Marcus. I appreciate the perspective there. And Pastor Jay, I'm going to pose that same question over to you: is why don't Black people honor the nation's flag the same way as white people?
I think that unfortunately, for many who went off and did literally gave their lives for our flag, who fought in wars, you can go back Civil War, World Wars 1 and 2, the Korean War, like we can go through all of these things, Vietnam. When those gentlemen returned home to the same level of racism, when you have things such as the GI Bill that was supposed to be an equal opportunity wealth builder, not even being given out at the same rate. And by the same rate, we're talking not even close. We're saying, out of maybe, for example, New York, New Jersey, they did a estimate out of 60,000 VA loans, less than 100 went to African Americans. When you're seeing this, and again, this flag is a symbol that is supposed to represent liberty or freedom and justice for everybody. And then you don't see that for yourself. You don't see that for your neighborhoods. You don't see that in your justice system. That can lead you to not view that symbol the same as someone else that may be benefiting from the very same system. I feel like that plays such a large role. I know how I've been treated in different places. Liberty and freedom is not something I completely have. There's still parts of this country I can't just go to and walk around by myself. There's certain, I have to be careful of what clothing I put on when I go to certain neighborhoods around here. I have to be careful of things that maybe someone else wouldn't have to be. And I feel like that's not the liberty, that's not the freedom that our flag is supposed to represent. If I know that the justice system, if myself and Pastor Kevin go commit a crime right now, hey, we're both in the same place doing the exact same thing. He's liable to get a much lower sentence than me. And that's statistically proven. So I believe that plays a large role. Again, when you're seeing this, not just for yourself, but for your family, for your friends repeatedly over and over, it will lead you to not view that symbol exactly the same as maybe someone else that's having a very different experience.
Thanks for sharing, Pastor Jay. Good to hear your perspective, and Dr. Marcus. I think we all have some wide-ranging perspectives on that. If I add to that, I think I have to just kind of tap into my upbringing. Like my dad's from Oxford, Mississippi. Born in 1936, so he's right there during the Jim Crow era. And so, when my dad came here, I wasn't raised with the idea that I could become anything that I wanted to be, and that there was justice and liberty for all. I mean, that's not the message I got at home. So I grew up with, like, I didn't have much of a emotional attachment to the flag whatsoever. I mean, I knew it was a symbol for our country, but beyond that, it really meant nothing to me, because it wasn't put into me. My dad didn't hate the country, but he wasn't, I mean, I can't say that he was a patriot. I mean, he experienced not the greatest experiences as a Black man in America. And so again, that was just some things that he passed down to us. So for me, again, I guess you can say I'm kind of indifferent to the flag. I actually have a flag at home that's important to me, only because it was the flag that was drenched over my grandfather's casket when he passed away. But that's like the only flag that really means something to me. And again, I don't have anything against it. I just don't have the same emotional attachment to it. And I'm sure I speak for a good number of other people as well as Jay and Dr. Marcus as well. And so I just think we probably could just come up in a community where it really wasn't just hammered home that this is a reality for you. And so hopefully that adds some color a little bit from the different perspectives. Look like Dr. Marcus want to add to that.
Yeah, just real quickly, this maybe a metaphor is a even playing field, right? Is what it's supposed to represent. But the reality is, we grow up in our community recognizing that the game is fixed, right? And so it really becomes that we view, a lot of us and individuals I grew up with in school, that there's two sets of notes that you have to have, because one set is for what our reality is, and the one set is for the reality that has been given to us and stated that this is what it is. And so we would love to be able to recognize that no matter what year it is, the situation, I have an equal chance. But that has not been the case consistently. Now, are there exceptions? Yes. But I think sometimes the broader narrative is that that persons of color, particularly African Americans, should grab a hold to the broader narrative that, hey, it is an even playing field because look, so and so made it, they're doing well. But those are really outliers when you compare to the large mass of individuals.
Thanks for sharing, Dr. Marcus. Look like Pastor Brian wanna add to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too when we think about the flag in general and this idea of pledging allegiance to the flag. And I think whether you're from the Black community or the white community, I think one of the things we always have to keep in check is this idea of understanding where our primary allegiance lies, right? So our primary allegiance lies, and I think I'm saying this more so as a white pastor to the white community more so than anybody else, because I think we have to remember that our primary allegiance is to the kingdom and to Jesus. And especially in seasons like we're in now, with it being so, close to the election and so highly politicized, it's really easy to lose sight of that. And so then the American symbols that we have that mean a lot to people and should mean a lot to people, because lots of people have, given their lives for it. I think at the same time, we have to keep it in check, because at the end of the day, like, America is not going to be what lasts into eternity, right? The kingdom of God is going to be the thing that lasts into eternity. And so that's one of the things that as a pastor, I'm always trying to communicate to our people, to say, we want to be grateful, yep, for what we have and where we are. But at the end of the day, it's our allegiance to the kingdom and King Jesus that should trump and be prioritized over anything else, even the country we live in now.
Thank you for adding to that, Pastor Brian. I think you hit it right on the head. I say it all the time. I just really believe at the end of the day, Jesus needs to be above anything that we prioritize in our country. Gonna move on to the next question. And Peter, I'm gonna pose this over to you. And that question is, why do white Christians give so much credence to non-Christian talk shows?
Let me preface this by saying the only talk shows I listen to on the radio are Chicago sports stations. So that probably already makes me someone that people don't want to listen to on this call. I think by and large, it's a failure of discipleship. I think that I'm going to paint some broad brushstrokes here, but there is a tendency within white Christianity, certainly Protestantism, but even in the last 50 years, the Catholic Church as well, where there is an embrace of material comfort and physical distance from poverty and poor people and non-white people. And the suburban mindset that many people who call themselves Christians have is that whatever the church provides is kind of a la carte for their life at large. And so they're going to, there's a focus a lot more on personal morality. Are you your children? Are you cheating on your wife? Do you return change at the store if they give you the wrong amount of change? But an inability to understand scripture and see Jesus's life as being something that spoke against systemic problems that existed in the nation of Israel, or the occupation by the Romans. And I don't think most pastors call their congregants to follow the one who had no place to lay his head. I think they call him to obey the things that are convenience, that do not get in the way of their lives being comfortable with the 6-foot fence around their big backyard and the 2 or 3 cars in the driveway and new bicycles for the kids and Xboxes and all the rest. I just think that we have a failure of discipleship in this country. And in Matthew, Jesus talks pretty clearly about the sheep and the goats. And I think that there's a lot of goats that think they're sheep, excuse me.
Thanks for sharing, Dr. Peter Borg. I forgot to call you doctor. You earned that. But no, thanks for your perspective. I'm going to pose that question. I'm going to swing it over to you, Kevin. And the question is, why do white Christians give so much credence to non-Christian talk shows?
Well, to the extent that that happens, I can't speak from personal experience. So this is more of my theory, I guess. But the theory comes from my training as a theologian and a church leader, that we have cultural Christianity, and the church and broader society has been enmeshed in people's minds for generations, and that's now deconstructing, right? The church is losing a privileged place that it's long had, but that's still hanging on. And so for generations, we've had the idea that I can be Christian based on my church membership, or I can be Christian based on, I say yes to this certain belief about my salvation. And not understanding kind of what Peter was talking about, discipleship, that in our baptism, we're called to follow Jesus in his mission on our daily life. And that's very different than being a Christian based on ascribing to a doctrine or belonging to a church institution. An example of this is with the pandemic, and when churches were mostly closed down and they would do surveys, people were pushing, they wanted the churches to open. And when they opened, those same people who surveyed that didn't show up for the most part. They liked the idea of churches being open. They weren't necessarily going to be active in, going to their church regardless. But there's this cultural Christianity. And so with that, in that mindset, I would be able to take in so-called cultural news sources or talk shows or things like that and conflate it with Christianity, because it's just enmeshed. And there's not a critical distinction for most people about the teachings of Jesus, living those out on a daily basis, and just kind of going with the flow of the privilege of cultural Christianity.
Thanks for sharing, Kevin. Appreciate your perspective on that. And I'm going to pose that question once more. Going to swing it over to you, Brian. Why is it does white Christians give so much credence to non-Christian talk shows?
Yeah, so there's 2 passages of scripture that surface in my mind in response to that, and one I can't find the direct reference to, but I'm pretty sure it's in 1st or 2nd Timothy. And since we're a bunch of pastors, if anybody knows the reference and wants to chime in, feel free. But it's it's somewhere, something where Paul talks about like, people are just going to start to listen to those who satisfy kind of their itching ears or whatever. Like they're going to listen to what it is that they think they want to listen to. Like we're going to surround ourselves with the teachers who just say the things that we like. And I'm pretty sure that's in 1st or 2nd Timothy. And so we live in a culture where 2 Timothy 4, great, thanks, Chris. We live in a culture that is just like anybody and everybody can say whatever. Everybody's got a platform, right? It's Facebook, it's a blog, it's a YouTube channel, it's Instagram. I've been thinking about this a lot because I feel like I am so tired of listening to things. What I'm really interested in is conversation. Like that's the thing that's driving me in terms of how do I get in conversation with people? Because our society is literally just full of talking heads, right? And I would say like I'm a part of that, right? I have a blog, I have a small YouTube channel. I'm teaching and saying things, and at some point, we're just gonna like. I think somebody else referenced the idea of an echo chamber. We're just going to surround ourselves with people who say the things that we want to hear. And so there's another passage that comes to mind that I think has been also turning over my head. And this is from 1 Thessalonians 4. Paul says, and we urge you, brothers and sisters, to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you. And that has been so much just turning over my mind. And I don't think it means like we stop speaking up for injustice, because I think we need to use our voice for those things. But instead of just like adding to the noise of the cultures to say, I think we need to build bridges to people to engage in relationship. And not feel like we have to command everybody's attention. So I wonder if part of the reason why we're drawn to talk shows is because we're conditioned to look for sound bites. And so what we want is we want the sound bite from whatever credible source we deem to be credible, whether it's true or not. But then we have this ammunition that we can use in conversation. So all we're trying to do is like, heavy up our arsenal so that we can just throw these random facts, these sound bites, these headlines, rather than doing the hard work of listening, asking good questions, and seeking to understand. I think that's one of the things that I've really appreciated about the Milwaukee Declaration is this sense of like we want to hear from one another and understand one another's perspectives. And I think that's the thing that God has been challenging me with, to say, like, I don't know what it's like to live in a world where Jay and Marcus live. Jay, you were saying like, you have to be mindful of the clothes that you wear when you go to certain parts of the city. But never once have I had to think about that. Like never once have I had to worry about the things I'm putting on my body to go anywhere in our city. And so for me, it's just a realization there are experiences that people have that I know nothing about. And the work that I need to do is to put myself in places where I can learn that. And so I think the best thing we can do is put ourselves in places where we are not with people who are exactly like us. That was one of the things I was challenged with in seminary. And I'll close with this is, I was going to I went to seminary in Chicago, and I was going to a suburban church, a big church, a white church. And then I met my wife, who's also white, and she was not going to a suburban white church. She was going to a church where she was the minority. And I was fascinated by that. My wife is much more drawn to different cultures, and more so than I am, just in her curiosity of learning about different cultures. So I just said, I think I need to go to church with you, when we started dating and got engaged and got married. And that was a very interesting experience for me, because it was probably the first time in my life I was a minority. And I was like, wow, like and in the school we were at really emphasized the international aspect of the school and really was trying to be multicultural and did a great job with it. And so I think instead of just listening to somebody who's going to say the thing we want them to say, we need to put ourselves in front of people who are going to say things that we just know are going to be different. And we need to listen and learn and seek to find ways to build bridges and have conversation rather than just using sound bites as ammunition.
Thanks, Brian. Really great perspective there, and yeah, real good nuggets there. And immediately, I just began to think about like where we're on Facebook now, but when you think about the algorithms of Facebook, if all you look at, I mean, if you look at conservative material, that's all Facebook is going to show you. If you look at liberal material, like that's all Facebook is going to show you with the algorithms, and it begins to appear like this is the view of everybody that I'm surrounded by, because you're like, man, it's here it go again, and it's like it's really impacting our whole perception. So I think it's really important that we are intentional about hearing different voices. We've got to be intentional, because if we won't be intentional about it, then we're just going to continue to flock to the same voices that we've continued to hear, and not allow ourselves to be challenged. And I think we don't grow until we allow ourselves to be challenged. And I mean, that was the reason why, they miss Jesus because he's staring them right in the face, but they refuse to allow themselves to be challenged. And so they killed them. And so every day we kill Jesus because we refuse to allow ourselves to be challenged.
Yeah. Can I say just one more thing about that? Yeah. So what Peter said earlier was this idea of a failure of discipleship. I think we need to be careful, and I'm speaking again to the white community, we need to look to Jesus in the scriptures to shape our view of the world. And we spend too much time looking to media, culture, and politics. And so we need to continually go back to the one who is and who was and who will be, to shape our view of the world, instead of thinking that culture is going to be ultimately the prime source of how we define reality.
Yeah, thanks again, Brian. Appreciate that. Next question I'm going to pose over to Dr. Marcus. And that question is, do black people condone the Black Lives? I'm sorry, do black people condone what the Black Lives Matter organization stand for?
Not speaking for every black person, but in general, I think the statement is what is embraced. I don't even know if the average black person has even viewed the Black Lives Matter website. When you talk about the masses of people, I'm sure many have, but I don't know if everyone has, to really be able to say, I stand with Black Lives Matter as an organization. But the statement in and of itself, Black Lives Mattering, I think wholeheartedly, that is a sentiment, an expression, a belief that resonates with Blacks, African Americans, the nation, the world over, because we know it's not just even in the U.S. But speaking of the U.S., yes, in terms of what the organization stands for, I think that's where there starts to be divisions within the broader Black or African American community, depending, because there's intersectionality that comes into play, right? Because as I understand it, Black Lives Matter is not just concerned with race or color, but there's also implications for class. There's implications in there as well for the perception of family, marriage, as well as sexual identity, inequality or equity along those lines. And so when you start to bring up the phenomenon of intersectionality, I think that's where you start to see people part ways. And so individuals perhaps who are in favor of equity for individuals who come from marginalized communities such as LGBTQ, then they will probably favor the organization a bit more, because that's one of the tenets, is fighting for a world and a society in which individuals who hail from that particular community are not marginalized, are not disenfranchised in any kind of way. But for those who do not necessarily support or subscribe to those lifestyles, then there may be some concern in terms of what the organization in its entirety actually stands for. But the statement and the push and the advocacy for the preserving Black lives and them mattering, then I think, yes, that's where a lot of Blacks, African Americans, do agree in that sense.
Thanks for sharing, Dr. Marcus. Again, appreciate your perspective. Good nuggets there. And Pastor Jay, I'm going to pose that same question over to you. Do Black people condone what the Black Lives Matter movement stand for?
I agree wholeheartedly with Pastor Marcus. I think there is for most of us, a huge distinction between the phrase and the organization. A majority of us are not involved with, donating to, participating with an organization when we're saying Black Lives Matter. We're simply stating the fact that we really want our lives to be important. And that statement, regardless of who's using it, that's not owned per se by any one organization or group. That's not something, I know a lot of people are really getting that mixed up. Well, I want to support you in equality, but I don't want to have this conversation because it represents, and it's like, no, don't. You pay money at a lot of places that donate and give money to a lot of things. And the only time this conversation comes up is when we start talking about Black Lives Matter. Walmart supports a lot of stuff. If we went down the line of Disney, and people are still in the middle of COVID trying to go to Disney World, there's a ton of stuff that Disney supports, but no one talks about the organization. I feel like it's another form of deflection in many ways. When I'm saying Black Lives Matter, it is specific to feeling as if my life has not mattered as much as some others. It is feeling like historically our lives have been shortchanged or looked at as being worth less than someone who's standing on this side. And it's wanting equality. It's seeing where the finish line is, where all lives really do matter, and realizing that my figure on the board isn't there yet. And we're trying to get to that location. So, 100%, I agree with you, Pastor Marcus, with what you're saying. I think a lot of people we're not going to the website and looking it up before we go out and start yelling the word, because I don't need an organization to teach me that I want Black lives to matter. I'm not here or marching or even in this conversation to support an organization. I'm here to try to make a difference so that people that look like me can hopefully live a life in which the playing field is equal, in which the opportunities are fair, in which if my qualifications look just like someone else's qualifications, my resume is not thrown into the garbage simply because my name sounds more ethnic. These are some of the realities. So no, I really believe that's part of the confusion, is that people are taking the organization and they're applying whatever they want to say about it to the real stance and chant in many areas that, hey, we want Black lives to be more important.
Thanks for sharing, Pastor Jay. Appreciate the nuggets there. Look like Dr. Peter wants to add to that. Go ahead.
It's such a political red herring that white people complain about that, because no one is asking those white people, do you defend everything that the neo-Nazis or the KKK stand for? But those two organizations would be out there chanting white lives matter. But the average white person in America doesn't have to go ahead and be asked to defend the KKK or the neo-Nazis or the folks down in Charlottesville with their Tiki Torch Parade or whatever it is. And so I just think that I lose patience for the types of questions that get asked, not for legitimate purposes, simply to try to go ahead and stall progress and get in the way of Jay's piece on the board, passing go and getting dollars. But wait, I probably shouldn't have said that, Jay. I'm sorry, because now there's welfare stuff going on out there that is going to get us in trouble. But you know what I mean, that your piece on the board is getting closer to equality. These questions they're very disappointing that you guys even have to answer it. It's really unfair that you're put in that position.
Thanks for sharing, Dr. Peter. I've had to address this question a number of times, but it's interesting, even still to this day. I've never been on the website. Actually, it's just this year I even learned it was an organization. I couldn't believe it was an organization. I'm like, it's an organization. Like, man, but even before then, it was nitpicking, because I had many people saying, well, like, all lives matter. Like, yeah, that's absolutely true. Specifically in the eyes of God, all lives matter. Unfortunately, in this country, Black lives have not mattered, and not so much, and it's interesting because more emphasis is put on Black lives that are unborn, than it is after they're born. Then like it's it's all good, but no, it's just really been a situation. Not many people that I know even know what the organization stand for, and again, still even to this day, even though now that I've learned that there is an organization, I never even went online to even see what the organization stand for, because it's not the organization that I condone. It's essentially just the statement itself, and I think it's a statement not to exclude all lives. It's a statement to say, essentially, like, we matter too. Like, help us. It's crying out. And so again, but from time and time again, I just see these word plays where it's like, you can always take the word play and like, oh man, there's a problem with the words that's being said here, as opposed to the substance that happened. And so I think as we continue to have these conversations, hopefully it adds some real understanding for people to understand what the issue is, and not dismissing other people's experiences. There's some people that have some real experiences, and I would never be one to dismiss a person's experience. I would want to understand more about their experience, but I wouldn't dismiss it and say, yeah, just comply, or whatever the reasons are, or some of the give backs we get when some of those issues are at hand. So we're going to move on to the next question, and I'm going to throw this question over to Pastor Kevin. We're beginning to hear many white churches get labeled as Marxist, communist, or liberal, but are any of those labels considered as sinful?
Well, in my mind, no. I guess the question is, are those labels accurate? Do they even fit within conversation of faith communities? Maybe people think that my church is liberal. I hear that about my denomination, part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA. And so we're one of a few different Lutheran denominations. And when people try to understand these different Lutheran denominations, oftentimes they'll say, oh, that ELCA, they're the liberal one. Well, we ordain women, we ordain people in the LGBTQ community. But we didn't make those decisions because we wanted to be liberal, or because we were relying on like secular liberal resources to make those decisions. We made those decisions based on our study of scripture and church teachings throughout history. So we weren't trying to be liberal. Maybe we ended up there in a different matrix of ways that people understand things. So my first comment is that it just isn't accurate a way of talking about church. But to the question, is it sinful? Well, if I'm loving my neighbor and I'm advocating for justice, and someone calls me a Marxist because of that, I don't think I'm sinning. I think I'm doing what Jesus is teaching me to do, and what I see the Holy Spirit doing in the world.
Thanks for sharing, Pastor Kevin. Going to pose that same question over to Pastor Brian. beginning to start to hear many white churches are being labeled as Marxist, communist, or liberal. But are any of those labels considered as sinful?
Yeah, I think the whole idea of labeling people and labeling churches and labeling groups of people is wildly unhelpful, because I think all of a sudden what we've done is we've just, somehow put them in a box, and we put all of our assumptions of that label on that group of people, and we have no knowledge of really who they are, what they're like, or any sort of relationship. And so, right in Matthew 7, when Jesus is in the middle of the sermon, near the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about don't judge. And I think what Jesus is saying there when he's talking about judgment is this idea of condemnation. Like, don't condemn people. And usually when we label people, oftentimes we're subtly condemning them in maybe what's a socially appropriate way. And rather than playing that condemning game, because it's easy to label somebody, it's easy to put them in a box, what we need to do is check our assumptions and say, before I start labeling anything or anybody or any organization, anything, I need to take the time to really get to know them. And again, labeling people is just a way we shortchange doing the hard work of understanding who they are and trying to build a bridge to understand them. And even if they are, right, even if they are like somebody who's different than me and they do fit some description, it doesn't mean right away that I should start all of a sudden saying, well, then they are sinful. Like, there's lots of people that Jesus spent time with who are very sinful. And so maybe, again, trying to figure out if that's sinful or not is it's trying to do the work of finding ways to build relationships with them rather than just labeling them so that we can dismiss them and discard them.
Thanks for sharing, Pastor Brian. Appreciate your perspective. I'm going to pose that same question over to Dr. Peter. We're beginning to start to hear some white churches are being labeled as Marxist, communist, or liberal. Are any of those labels considered as sinful?
I'd like to answer the question through the back door, if that's okay. Why is it that we don't use capital as a derogatory term for behavior? If you look at capitalism, it started with stealing land from Native Americans, then it enslaved a people group for over 250 years. It has caused children to be factory laborers. It has caused poor people to work in industries where their life expectancies are decreased. I guess I don't understand. There is this really false idea that there is something utterly holy and Christ-like about capitalism, and all those other systems are awful. And they'll say, well, look, the USSR under Stalin killed 20 million of his own people, so therefore it must be terrible. But capitalism has killed just as many people throughout world history. So I think I agree with Brian, we have to check our assumptions, but the assumption we have to check is any economic system perfectly holy? And it's not, because it's run by a bunch of sinful people who are trying to benefit themselves, who they love more so than anybody else. And so I just think that it once again shows inflation of culture and Christianity in white America that leads, again, back to this failure of discipleship. They think that if someone is a capitalist, then they must be closer to Jesus than somebody who claims some other, preference for a type of government.
Thanks for sharing your perspective on that, Dr. Peter. Pastor Jay, looked like you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's, I struggle with this specifically from a Christian standpoint in dealing with churches. When we get into the argue of what's more sinful or what's less sinful, when we're all sinful, when the reality is we've all fallen short, when the reality is we all deserve a punishment that none of us really want. And thank God for Jesus and what he's done. When James literally tells us to break any portion of the laws, to break all the law. And I keep running into people in conversations where we want to point out, whether it's Marxist or, lying, whether it's LGBTQ, or we want to talk about adultery, or we want to talk about any of these other things. And regardless, we're all sinful. And I agree with you, Peter. What makes capitalism the holy way of doing things? I think we've missed it when we start trying to point at churches and point at people and say that that's worse than this, and this sin is, well, that's an abomination. Yeah, but you know what? Pride is an abomination too. We don't talk about like all these things that are real from a biblical perspective. We're arguing over things that the reality is we're all sinful. We all have fallen short. We all need a savior. And I'm just thankful for Jesus. That's really what it comes down to. So, when I run into Christians or really get into those conversations, I kind of just exit. I take it. I don't even want to get into that conversation with you because you're completely missing, in my mind, you have 100% missed the heart of Christ when you want to start comparing sins and you want to start comparing what you believe is more sinful and what's less sinful. When God says everything we do that we believe is righteous is still filthy to him, we have no basis to stand on to call anything more sinful than anything else.
Thanks for sharing, Pastor Jay. Going to move on to the next question, and I'm going to pose this over to Dr. Marcus. And this question is essentially related to George Floyd. And the question that was asked was, why are Black people making a hero out of a criminal?
Wow, that's a very loaded statement. Pastor Jay used a word earlier, and that is deflection. It's easier to demonize, right? If you let the state call him, if you let the state tell the narrative, right? Jesus was also a criminal. But yeah, it's a way to. It's always easy to assuage your guilt or culpability to demonize a person who, in many folks' eyes, is a martyr, right? And so Dr. Peter referenced Jesus Christ. So to assuage the conscience, perhaps, of the Jewish leaders, right? Point out that he broke all of our laws, right? He's not a friend of Caesar, so his death is justifiable. But for anyone who would make that claim, I can't help but think about the monuments that exist in our nation, the names of universities, the buildings and university campuses that are named after people who own slaves. There are at least 10 to 12 US presidents who were slave owners, and their schools named after them. We've had generations of children who've been educated in buildings named after individuals who thought so low of enslaved Africans to actually enslave them and participate in that diabolical trade. So it just seems it's laughable to me to want to highlight whether it's true or not. I don't think that matters. And so then the question becomes, well, okay, let's say that this individual, this man, this gentleman actually was guilty of something. Did he deserve to die? I thought that's what we had a justice system for. I thought that's why we had due process. Even if a person is guilty, due process is still a part of our rights. We have the 14th Amendment, right? So to me, it's a deflection, and it's a way to preserve the conscience and the psyche of a person or a group that does not want to own the fact that racism is real and that systemic oppression continues to be something that our nation deals with. I think if we look at even some of what happened in the wake of Mr. Floyd's death, where you had people that were pulling down different statues and monuments because they said enough is enough. We want to stop paying homage to individuals who help to contribute to this problem. And for all that I know, if we really, to Pastor Jay's point, if we want to measure criminality, I'm pretty sure whatever Mr. Floyd was accused of is far less than what many others individuals are guilty of if you just want to weigh it on the scales. So that's my reaction when I think about that.
Thanks for sharing, Dr. Marcus. Pastor Jay, we're going to pose that same question over to you in relation to George Floyd. Why are Black people making a hero out of a criminal?
First of all, my first word, we stop it. That's really how I feel when I hear that question. Stop it. What Black people are you around that are making George Floyd into a hero? You know, I would want to know, who are you talking to? Where are you hanging out at that you are seeing all these Black people create a hero out of George Floyd? When I think of a hero, I think of someone who has an ability or a power or, you know, something that's life-saving that I wish I could do. I wish I could be like. I want to pattern myself after. And I don't know many people that are running around saying, I want to be like George Floyd. You know, I don't see people with t-shirts on. I'm not seeing people on television. So where is that from? You're seeing people protesting and marching because of his death. Because for us, we looked at that and saw something happen that should not have happened, period. There is no excuse. There's nothing you can say that validates someone kneeling on top of another person until they die. That's what we saw. That's not making him a hero. For us, that's looking at George Floyd and saying, my God, that could have been me. Someone could pull me out of a car, and that could happen. Police officers, unfortunately, there were 4 of them there, and this still happened. There were people around, and it still happened. There were people video recording, yelling, get off of him, he can't breathe. It still happened. This grown adult man cried for his mother, and it still happened. So that's not something that I'm making a hero out of. I can name heroes. You know, Jesus is a hero. Superman is a hero. We can go down a list of heroes. I'm not seeing George Floyd as a hero. I'm not seeing him as a martyr for the cause. You know, I've heard people saying that you're treating him like a martyr. No, we're treating him like a man that died that should not have. He should still be here. Even if he was in jail, even if he did what they said he did, he should have had his day in court. He should have went through the system, whether it was a fine, a ticket, or a county jail or whatever. He should have had that opportunity as opposed to dying in the street that way. So we're not upholding him as a hero. You know, again, I challenge that. If you are, where are you finding those Black people at? And if you say Candace Parker, I'm gonna throw something at the screen. Don't listen to her. But where are the rest of these Black people at that you're seeing this from, that you're saying are calling him a hero? Because I don't know one who's saying he's a hero. What I do see are people that are hurt, that are tired, that are upset, that saw something happen that many of us have been saying has been happening, and we literally said, that's it, that's enough, we're not dealing with it. And then for a lot of my white brothers and sisters, they saw it and realized for maybe the first time, maybe they haven't been lying. And they came out in force as well, because all of us looked at that and said that was wrong.
Yeah, if I could just add, I think I agree. It's like, that's why I said it's laughable. Yeah, I can't even fathom that. That was the first time I've even actually heard that notion at all. But I also think this is important to lift up. Like, every time this has happened, and unfortunately there were more after George Floyd, right? Every one of those deaths is an aggregate, right? We don't view it as just that individual, right? When we see Mr. Floyd on the ground, and there were references to Emmett Till, right? It is all the wrongful deaths that we begin to lament, that we recall, and that we remember. But we don't view any of those folks as heroes. Like, we don't want to be them. It's very painful. It's very painful. But the piece I want to just draw attention to was that all these questions are linked, right? This is why you have the concern with the flag. This is why Black Lives Matter is being, shouted from the rooftops. All of these things, this notion of you can only do that to someone that you don't think is a human being, someone you don't think is a man, someone that you really believe is 3/5 of a person, right? Is animal-like. And again, these are these deflections. It's just like in what you call race science, where there was actually a disease called drapetomania that was purported to cause slaves to want to run away. So to counter this disease, they have to be beaten. They have to be abused with all kinds of different torturous mechanisms, because otherwise they're going to want to leave the plantation. So it's more victim blame that's veiled in language to make those who empathize seem like they're idiots, and that's just further insult to injury.
Thanks for sharing, both Pastor Jay and Dr. Marcus. And these are questions in which I love these forums, because many of the questions that's asked here are asked in rooms of homogenous groups of people. So if you're Black, you probably never heard that question before, because that's a question that's asked only in the white community. And some of the questions that's asked on the other side of the aisle are questions that you only hear in the Black community. And so this is what make what we do, I think, so valuable, because we can provide those answers in a non-threatening way. And so I think my only add to that, and how I would answer that question, is like, man, like, the only thing that separates us from a criminal is that we haven't been caught. I'm thankful to Jesus that man, that like many of us had the opportunity to get it right and to get it straight, and to get a second chance. And specifically for those questions to be coming from the faith community is kind of problematic, because our whole our whole purpose is to see people receive a second chance and to be born again, not to kill them and send them to hell. That's not what we want to do. And so when I heard that question, the first thing I thought about was the criminal that was being crucified next to Jesus. And Jesus, like, man, this day, like, man, you're gonna be with me in paradise. And so, that's a criminal's reward, is this day to be spent in paradise. And so, again, hopefully we'll just bring us some understanding to some of the issues at hand on both sides of the aisle. We're getting close to our time, so I'm gonna be cognizant of our time together. Got a couple more questions we're gonna try to get through. And so I'm going to pose this question over to Pastor Kevin. And the question is, if Black people were the dominant culture and education was taught based on that culture, do you think there would be educational disparities for white people?
I guess it depends in that scenario how much we flesh out the scenario historically. Are we imagining that our curriculum now is more inclusive and representative in our current society, that we would just increase the representation and inclusiveness of our curriculum? Then no, that's not going to turn the apple cart over, the opposite direction that our society is now, as far as the power imbalance and opportunity imbalance. But if that imaginative scenario is like to match historically what has happened here, where that one ethnic group is in a minority and systemically, legally and culturally marginalized, then you're going to get the same results regardless, right? This isn't about skin color. It's about institutional power, cultural power. So when we talk about race, that's what we need to talk about. It's not about just personal bias. We all have personal biases. It's about societal structural influences that we often don't see and often don't put our finger on and name. but have influence on the way we interact with the world and the way we come to understand things. So yeah, we need to see a lot more use of representation in our curriculum. My wife is a curriculum director, actually. So we have these conversations at home. So I hope that every school district is working toward that goal.
All right. Well, thanks again for sharing, Pastor Kevin. Pastor Brian, I'm going to pose that same question over to you. And the question is, if Black people were the dominant culture and education was taught based on that culture, do you think there would be educational disparities for white people?
You know, it's interesting when you think of that question, because the assumption of that question is, you know, the dominant culture ultimately will marginalize everyone else, right? And I don't know if that's necessarily the case. And I think this for me kind of gets beyond some of what I kind of feel like I have expertise in. But I don't think, you know, and I think this is what, you know, Kevin was saying, you know, it's not so much a, you know, simple black or white issue when it comes to this, as much as it is, you know, how we abuse power. And so those are the things that I think oftentimes we run for, because we think the more power that I have, the more control that I have, the more that I can get me what I want. And, you know, the trickle down effect is somebody's then going to suffer under that. So, you know, I don't think the dominant culture necessarily seeks to provide disparities as much as those who are in power, who abuse their power or really pursuing it for selfish reasons. The trickle down effect comes from there.
Thanks for sharing, Pastor Brian. And Dr. Peter, I'm going to pose a different question to you, if that's okay, just for the sake of time. Want to make sure we got through most of our questions today. This is essentially the opposite of the question that we asked about George Floyd. And this question is, why are white people making heroes out of bad cops?
I think for a couple of different reasons. First of all, the vast majority of white Americans have never had a negative interaction with a cop. Period. Second of all, sticking up for bad cops is necessary in order to maintain your narrative about what America is. There is an inability to recognize that there could be something wrong with America, and everything in that therefore has to flow back from that, whether it be foreign policy decisions and wars that we should have never fought, whether it be public servants who really make everybody, all the good cops' jobs more difficult. It all has to fit in with this narrative around what you have based your existence upon.
Thanks for sharing, Dr. Peter. Gonna switch up a little bit, and I'm gonna pose a question to Dr. Marcus. The question is, do Black people condone the rioting that's taking place across America?
Well, I think you know, too often we kind of get painted into these either or, these false binaries. And so the reality is there are some who probably would, because they would compare it to, you know, bricks versus a body. And so if we're going to preserve anything, they're going to opt to preserve the body over the bricks. You can't get a life back, but you can always build again. So there would be some who probably do condone it. But the vast majority of folks, especially people that I know, that I talk to, do not. There are individuals who are familiar or know folks who own businesses that have been damaged, that have been destroyed. And in many cases, some of these very people are advocates for justice, along with the people who are, you know, perhaps guilty of some of the destruction. I think it's also important to highlight that it's been documented that in many cases there are outside agitators that have been coming into neighborhoods and cities to deliberately skew the narrative. So to make it seem as though the ones who are actually peacefully protesting are also the ones who are engaged in destructive acts. But no, I think the average African American recognizes that, especially in our own community, we need infrastructure. We need healthy and fruitful businesses that can contribute to the economics of those different locations. And so, yes, on one end, because of the hurt, because of what Pastor Jay said to start off, it keeps happening. There are some people that are like, yeah, I'm tired of it. But even then, once that kind of rage, anger begins to subside, I believe a lot of those same folks who may be indifferent, ultimately they recognize that, hey, we need to have, we don't need to engage in destructive measures. But like I said, when you compare what's happened to our community, some people feel like it's just desserts. I don't condone that. That's not a kingdom perspective or mentality. But are there those who do hold that view? Yes, but I don't believe that represents the vast majority.
Thanks for sharing, Dr. Marcus. Great perspective there. And I'm just going to add to that is like, for me, I mean, I don't condone the rioting. However, when people ask me that question, and I've gotten asked that question a number of times, and for those of you that are watching and know me that have asked me that question, here's what I would say. I'm going to say you shouldn't ask me that question without asking the questions that on the other end. Is like that shouldn't be the question that's asked without talking about somebody's life being taken away. So let's not just deflect from one issue and demonize one issue, but don't demonize the other issue. And so for me, if we're going to talk about moral wrongs that's happening in our society, let's say that rioting is bad and killing people, unarmed people, is bad. let's why is it either or? I mean, and it's, I mean, so it needs to be inclusive of the argument. So if you're going to ask me about the rioters, also ask me about like bad cops. And I know all cops aren't bad, but all cops aren't good. You're not going to make me believe that all there's good and bad people on both sides of the aisle. And so I think we just need to be realistic about that and be sympathetic and empathetic of our brothers and sisters on all sides of the aisle. I think as a Christian community, that we have a responsibility to model who Christ is, even across the aisle. If I'm a liberal, I need to model Christ to my conservative brother. If I'm a conservative, don't you think you have a responsibility to model Christ to your liberal brother? Whatever, I mean, no matter what side of the aisle people are on, we have a responsibility to be imitators of Christ in those spaces and places. And so, in closing, thank everybody for joining us this evening. Before we leave, I just want to give each of our panelists an opportunity to have some closing words, and I'm going to say 45 seconds or less because our time is running low. But in 45 seconds or less, if there's anything that you want to give in closing statements, Pastor Jay, I'll start with you.
First and foremost, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for having this, and thank you for allowing me to be here. I love all of you guys. I always enjoy getting a chance to talk and hang out. For anybody that is watching or listening to this, I think you understand just as well as we do how divided everything is right now. And we get to make a decision on if we individually continue to push that narrative. Pastor Kurt, I agree with you. We get to make a decision of how we represent Christ to others. And just because I have not experienced something does not force me to not listen to their experience. And I think that's what I'm seeing a lot of people on both sides. We need to be able to have conversations, listen to each other, understand where each other is coming from, and then how do we move forward now that we've both been able to talk about it and that I've been able to listen, you've been able to listen. And those are conscious decisions that we actually can make. So I think if we can turn out all of the outside white noise, get rid of that, and really focus on loving people, being who Christ really called us to be. And, I love what Brian said, really pledging our allegiance to the kingdom. I think we can really make a world of difference here.
Thanks for sharing, Pastor Jay. In 45 seconds, Pastor Kevin, if you can give any closing thoughts.
I want to say thank you to fellow panelists, but thank you to the viewers. If you're here watching and listening, it's because something in you has a curiosity. There's empathy coming from you to hear from other perspectives. So I just want to encourage you that is the right track. A lot of the questions you've heard us discuss today all focus around the idea that there are things in the conversation around us, questions being posed, that act as deflections and shields so that our hearts don't have to have empathy and compassion and love for the neighbors we see who are suffering in various ways. So if you're tapping into that empathy right now, you're on the right track. That vulnerability, love is vulnerable, and our hearts beat when the shield isn't impermeable. So thank you for being with us, and continue on this road.
All right, thanks for sharing, Pastor Kevin. Dr. Peter, any closing thoughts in 45 seconds or less?
I'd like to go big picture real quick. And again, thank you, like others have said, for listening. Over the next week, we're all going to be inundated with election. And if, as people who claim to be redeemed by Jesus, we are filtering our faith through a political lens rather than filtering our political preferences through a Christian lens, then we are damaging the witness of the gospel, not only to our neighbors and people that we work with, but to this country and the entire world. So I would really just encourage people to put their hope in Jesus and not in politics, because that does not solve ultimately the problem that we all are haunted by, which is our sin. So consider where your hope is this week, and live there. Live out of what Jesus has done for you, not what some political party promises to do for you.
Thanks for sharing, Dr. Peter. Pastor Brian, closing statements.
Yeah, I think the thing that I would say in closing is, as witnesses of Jesus Christ, the thing that we can do to continue to bear witness is to learn how to listen and love. And so if we can continue to resist the temptation to label people and put them in a box so we can then easily condemn and discard them, if we can resist that and just really say, what is it about that person that's different than me that I should exercise compassionate curiosity around to know their story better, then I think we would find the conversation would shift dramatically if more and more people would do that. So thanks again for having me, and thanks to everybody who tuned in. This has been a great experience. So glad to be a part of it.
Thank you, Pastor Brian. And Dr. Marcus, closing statements, 45 seconds or less.
Sure. Thanks, Pastor Kurt. Shout out to all the panelists and viewers as well. The Lord shared something with me years ago, and that was, I was recently reminded of it, and that was, be careful that you don't get caught fighting the wrong thing. And that's something that I want to share with those who are viewing this. And I believe it's been said, but I'll echo it, that one of the surest ways that we don't find ourselves in that space is to pursue truth. Proverbs 23:23 says, buy the truth and sell it not. And the reality is, in the kingdom, truth is a person, and his name is Jesus. He says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And so everything that we need has already been provided. And if we follow Jesus, he'll show us the way to the life that we want to have for ourselves, and that everyone else should also be afforded. So God bless, and please pursue and embrace truth at all costs.
Thank you, Dr. Marcus. I want to say thank you to all of our panelists today from the Milwaukee Declaration. I am just honored to be able to serve with all of these gentlemen, and I just see in what people would call the most segregated city in the country, but yet there's a group of suburban and urban pastors, black and white, and anything in between that are coming together against the racial divides in our city, leading the conversations against that divide through the lens of the gospel. And hopefully we've had an opportunity to inspire you to live and walk in the ways of the gospel as we lead these conversations to bring forth racial reconstruction just throughout our communities. And so thank you guys for joining us. If you're looking for some takeaways, I want to point you to basics.com. You can go to their website. They have what they call front row seats. And so if you don't have any black friends, you don't have any white friends, you don't have anybody to talk to on the other side, it's a great way for you to be able to get connected and to have some safe conversations with people on the other side of the aisle. So certainly encourage you to go to Basics website and get signed up for that. With that being said, again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to all of our panelists. And until next time, may your light shine in the earth and over to the other side. God bless you all. Thank you.